SPJIMR's Center for Wisdom and Leadership presents its podcast series, Sapience. It is about the practical aspects of a wisdom-based approach on leadership, various global and societal issues.
Hello, welcome to Sapience, a special podcast series brought to you by SPJIMR Center for Wisdom and Leadership. I am Surya Tahora, Executive Director of CWIL, and today for the 6th episode, I will be in conversation with Dr Judith Gluck. So Judith Gluck is a professor of development psychology at the University of Klagenfurt in Austria. Her research work is centered around the manifestation of wisdom in real life, situational and contextual factors that influence wise behavior, new approaches for measuring wisdom, also the development of wisdom through an interplay of life experiences and psychological resources, the relationship of wisdom and morality, and finally, people's conception of wisdom across cultures. Welcome, Judith. It's really a pleasure to have you on this podcast. And really, you're somebody that I wanted really to meet and converse with for a long time. So it's really a treat for me to have you with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
So Judith, I'm a great fan of your writing because there is so much clarity and some kind of directness in the language, which and you know that our audience here for this podcast need not be necessarily researchers. And so I will ask you a difficult question, but I mean, rather than difficult, direct question. And I have in mind our audience. And let's first of all explore this amazing story of this elephant and how you have used this Indian story of elephant to illustrate the different conception of wisdom which are floating.
Yeah, well, I try to make this simple, even though that the model in itself is a little bit complicated. But yeah, I think I can do this. So yeah, I'm sure you know the story of the elephant, or of the blind man with the elephant. It actually is where there's these several blind men, and all of them are trying to figure out what an elephant is, but as they cannot see the elephant, so each of them is just basically touching one part of the elephant and describing the elephant in terms of what they are feeling right now. So they have very different ideas of what an elephant is. And somehow for a long time, I had been struggling with the fact that there are so many different definitions of wisdom. Basically, there are as many definitions of wisdom, I think, as there are wisdom researchers, or almost as many. And it's always interesting to look at the wisdom researchers I know, and I guess I know most of them, because often some aspects of their own personality are somehow reflected in their conceptions of wisdom. So that's really nice to think about. But I was wondering, my impression was, and also some of the data we had collected was saying that basically we are all talking about the same thing or a very similar thing, but we're just focusing on different parts, like the different parts of this elephant of wisdom. And so Nick Westrate and I tried to kind of figure out how all of these different conceptions of wisdom could somehow come together in a model that integrates all of them, or almost all of them, I should say, or almost all components of almost all wisdom models. So basically, what we tried to do is understand not wisdom as a trait that some people have and other people have less so, but as wise behavior. We tried to understand why people are sometimes able to act wisely in difficult situations and sometimes not so much. And so a wise person would be one that is more often able to act wisely, even in highly challenging situations. And when we started thinking about it this way, then we found that all of the different components of wisdom came together in this nice way. So basically, the idea of the elephant model is that there are two big parts of wisdom. One is a cognitive part and one is a non-cognitive part. And the cognitive part is basically how wisely we are able to think about complex problems. So that a wise person would have a lot of knowledge about life and about the complexities of life. And a wise person would be able to, at the same time, know that different people have different perspectives, and that all of these perspectives are legitimate because they are kind of building on those people's different experience. And a wise person will know how much they do not know, right? So a wise person is very much aware of the limitations of their own knowledge. So wise thinking basically consists of having a lot of knowledge, but also knowing the limitations of this knowledge and the extent to which different perspectives matter. And the third cognitive component is basically self-reflection. So a wise person will be willing to also question their own thinking. They will be aware, or try to be aware, of biases they might have, blind spots they might have, some things they just don't want to see. So a wise person would have this kind of broad, multi-perspectival kind of knowledge, and this complex way of thinking about complex problems. And I would say that most of us can do this relatively well sometimes, but at other times we can't. And that's where the non-cognitive components of wisdom come
so
in.
can we pause a moment, Judith? Because
Yes, sure.
here itself, I have some questions. So we speak about the cognitive, let's say, dimension of wisdom, and you're saying it's about thinking. And
Yes.
still at the same time, when that I'm working in this leadership, let's say, kind of space, and I am confronted with, when I have discussion with CEOs and people at these higher levels of in big companies or even in small companies, some entrepreneurs, they are smart people. They're extremely smart, and they have also knowledge of their domain, not just technical, but also what are the trends and what are the different, let's say, stakeholders and so on. So what distinguishes a smart person or a smart leader, we'll see maybe later, from what is this component, what you call this cognitive component of wisdom? What is really the difference here?
Well, I would say you can be very smart in terms of having a lot of knowledge and also being able to reason logically about the
Yeah.
knowledge you have and about the things you are thinking about. But you might not be very much aware of your own limitations, right? We actually did a study once. One of my students did a study where she interviewed relatively high-level managers
Okay.
about situations in their own life where they thought they had been wise and unwise. And many of them, that was really interesting, talked about situations where they had still been very young, as the unwise situation. And then they basically said, yeah, at the time I thought I knew everything, and I thought I could control everything. And then I
Okay.
failed. And then I learned so much from that failure. And now I'm much wiser because I also know what I cannot know, or what I cannot control, and what I cannot predict. So I think that's one component, the kind of being aware of one's own limitations, which is not necessarily a part of being smart, right? And the other one would
Absolutely.
probably be the awareness of different perspectives. You might just be very smart and very sure that you are right and that your perspective is the only one. And you might even be right, but a wise person would always kind of question the idea that their perspective is the best or the only one, right? So wise thinking would, I think, be more willing to criticize oneself, to question oneself. And some smart people might also do that, right? But then they would
Absolutely.
probably
Yeah.
be not just smart but wise. Right. So
So
that would be
one
the
question
cognitive
about just
idea.
this,
Hmm.
just to close maybe on this question of cognitive, let's say, components. Um, this knowledge about, let's say, the world and how an organization works, for example, how life situation unfold, how relationship with other unfold, which is, let's say, called in the literature like pragmatics of life or procedural
Yes.
knowledge or things like that. So, I mean, isn't it that you acquire that just by experience?
Yes.
So one would tend to say that, yeah, if I have 10, 15 years experience in a given field and I've worked in a few companies and having handled different scenarios and difficult situations, I will be on this component quite developed. Can
Yeah,
we
I
say
would
that?
think so. I mean, I would still think experience in itself might not make people experts because basically I think the idea here is talking about expertise, right? So you become an expert if you focus on something or some topic for a long time and kind of really aim to learn about it and try to understand it and really try to figure it out. And then over time you gain this lot of knowledge. um, yes, so I think that would be something that comes with experience. People might still have fewer or less blind spots. So some people might just, especially I think people who are very successful, might just believe that they know exactly how to do it, right? And sometimes they might be successful because they are very good, but they might also be successful because they are kind of lucky or because the times are good for being in a particular field or whatever. So
and even
I
power
really
itself
believe that.
comes with these blinders, right? When
Yeah,
you're in situation of power.
exactly.
Yeah,
And that's why some people get very successful and not always the wisest people are the most successful people, I guess. So that's a kind of interesting systemic question, right? What types of people our systems reward and whether these are really the people we want to be in the leadership position. So that's another really
absolutely.
interesting
Yeah.
topic, I think, right?
So I have read some studies saying that, I mean, it's quite controversial, but there is a certain element of truth where people who have been successful, there is a high percentage. I mean, I think the numbers were something like 15-20% were like perfect profile of narcissistic and at the
Yes.
borderline of being sociopaths also, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I've,
And
I've,
these
I've
are the
heard that
one
too.
that the
And yeah.
system is bringing up. Like,
Exactly, right. And that might explain some some of the problems our world is facing, right? So that's really, that's really,
yeah.
I think, a major issue. How do you create systems? I think that's an issue that I don't have any answer to, but I think is really important. How do you create systems that bring the right people to the leadership positions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're distinguishing in these cognitive components, just to stay again with that, between life knowledge and self knowledge. So can you accumulate expertise and so on without also knowing much about yourself and be label wise, or is difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally an interesting question how closely these different components are related because I think they're really hard to separate. When it's the kind of wisdom related knowledge that we are talking about, I think you cannot really gather a lot of life knowledge without also accumulating self knowledge in a way. Because when you learn about life, even if you learn about how other people are different from you, it's also learning something about you, right? So I think
Right.
generally, and also the self-reflective component and also this whole perspective taking, this idea of thinking in multi-perspectival ways, this is all just a kind of knowledge, I guess, right? So knowing that different people see things differently for good reasons is a kind of knowledge, but it's also a way of thinking, right? So I think these things
Absolutely.
are hard to separate. Some people like Ursula Staudinger have proposed this kind of basic distinction between general knowledge and personal knowledge. And I do think there are people who are kind of generally wiser in thinking about life theoretically, but much less wise when it comes to their own life. But that's
Absolutely.
actually something that we are trying to explain in our model a little bit, how thinking about your own life is always much more emotional, and therefore it might be hard to basically use the same kind of knowledge that you have about life in general. So the simple
Right.
idea of giving advice to a good friend about a difficult problem can be a lot easier than giving advice to yourself when you have the same problem, because about ourselves we just have this, of course, these strong feelings, right? We don't want to be in certain ways, and we want to be a certain kind of person, and we don't want to see certain sides of ourselves, and all that makes it really difficult for us to think about our own problems the way we can easily think about other people's problems,
Okay.
which is part of the
So
non-cognitive component, actually.
yeah, exactly. So now we are coming to this non-cognitive. So I like one sentence which is like very powerful and very brief, which says, yes, the non-cognitive components can be summarized in three words. A wise person who has these components is open, calm, and caring. Right.
Right. I
So
think that's
what are these?
basically the three
Yeah,
components.
what are these non-cognitive components exactly? Can you please elaborate a bit, Judith, on that? Then we'll go to the connection between the two, right? The
Yes, right.
relationship between these two. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess you can already see that they are connected, right? Because
Yeah.
openness, again, has to do a lot with being willing to see different perspectives. So this is kind of the non-cognitive part of seeing different perspectives, just being open to seeing different perspectives, being actually interested in them, right? Wise people are very interested in life. So even if, whatever, let's say they're in a conflict and they are kind of, they are wrong, let's say, in the conflict, they will be willing to see that they are wrong, not just because they have enough self-esteem to accept that they are wrong sometimes, but also because they're actually interested in understanding the problem. So they might have this motivation to simply understand, which kind of also creates a kind of openness to seeing different people's perspectives. So if this other person tells them that they feel how they feel about the way they act in the situation, they might be like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't think I came across like that, right? So they are really open and interested in seeing different perspectives. So that's one component. Openness also means being open, like in the classical sense, to new experiences, being willing to try things out, which also just gives you opportunities to learn things about life, right? Then the second one, as you said, is calmness, or being able to regulate emotions effectively, which does not mean ignoring or suppressing emotions. It means
Right.
really being willing to even perceive complicated emotions in oneself and others, to actually pay attention to emotions, but then to be able to also regulate them and to not, just freak out in a conflict and say really stupid things that you regret 10 minutes later. A wise person will be able to kind of deal with their emotions. They will be able to see, okay, I'm really angry now because of whatever history there is behind this conflict. But I'm also able to take a step back, look at the broader picture, and not say things that I will regret. So that would
Yeah.
be the calmness component. And the third
Mhm.
one, which I think is probably more than just one component. It's probably like this guiding motivation behind wisdom, which is really caring about others, or more generally, what Sternberg calls a common good. Basically, not wanting to win in an argument, but to want to solve a problem so that the best possible solution for as many people as possible results from it.
Yeah. So this other-centered versus only self-centered also
Yes,
disposition.
exactly.
So what I'm hearing here, Judith, is interesting because this non-cognitive components seem to be deeper. I mean, because one can be open, but here you're saying be open to reflect about some fundamental questions about life as well, right? And not just a question which is like a tactical question or something which will help me move ahead and so on, which but something so, and
Yes.
also this concern for others also is something which is at a deeper level. So is this because of this that you're calling it non-cognitive, or how do you distinguish that elements here?
Yeah, I would call them non-cognitive because they are basically emotional in some broad sense,
Ah,
right? Being open to perspectives in the way you are saying, but it basically means not being afraid of, yeah, hearing a perspective that might challenge your own ideas, right? So it has to do something with this emotional, okay, no, I don't want to hear this, versus,
right.
okay, let's see, this is really interesting. I never thought about this before, right? So there's a strong emotional component to it. Though, of course, I think that as we will come to, these non-cognitive aspects are really important because they lead people to think wisely, right? So they are basically a prerequisite for being able to reason wisely. Yeah, and the same goes, I think there's to each of those components, there's a lot of depth when you start looking into them. If you take openness, like the
Yeah,
general big five classical idea of openness to experiences
true.
includes things like being willing to try new foods or things like that. That's nice, but it's not the kind of openness that I mean, right? I'm really into openness about ideas and perspectives. And the same
Hmm.
goes for this kind of caring for others component. You can care about others in many different ways. You can just be empathetic because you kind of can't stand their suffering because it makes you suffer too. And I
Yeah,
believe that the kind of empathy that I'm interested in is more cognitive in a way. So it's the willingness to really do something about
do
other
something.
people's
Yes.
suffering, right? And you don't
Yeah,
have to feel, you don't even have to feel their suffering really deeply. Actually, it might be not so good if you feel it too deeply, because then you may not just not be able to stand
it
it.
could
It's
paralyze you.
more about
Absolutely. Yeah,
it's more about
yeah.
this motivational thing, right? Really wanting to do something to kind of make the world a better place, or to just help this one person, or whatever is in between, right?
Okay, so now we have this model with non-cognitive on one side and the cognitive on the other side. So what is the relationship? Because it's very interesting what you're saying in your research, that they're related, but in a very peculiar manner. So can you explain that
Yeah, and
more?
in a kind of complicated way that's not so easy also to test empirically with our psychological methods, because
Right.
the idea is, first of all, let's start with a complicated problem, right? You are in some kind of
Yeah.
really complicated conflict, and even
Yes.
then already the non-cognitive components will influence the extent that the way you feel about the problem. If you are high in those non-cognitive components, calmness and empathy, openness, then you will be able to feel less challenged, less emotionally aroused. You will be able to say, okay, what's happening here? Let's take a look at this. Let's see why the other person is behaving so strangely or whatever. Let's try to understand. So you're in this kind of one step back mode where you're kind of, okay, willing to take a wise stance on the problem. Whereas another person who does not have much of these non-cognitive qualities might already be like yelling and running around with their hair on fire and basically saying, this has to stop immediately or whatever. And this is not a good starting point. And then
Right.
the fact that some people, wiser people, are in this more wise mindset, basically in the face of the problem, enables them to use all those cognitive components they have, right? Because I guess
Oh, so what you're
most people
saying
have
is that,
experienced this, right? You cannot,
yeah,
you know
exactly.
what would be right in a situation, but you're just too angry or too anxious or whatever. You just can't do the wise thing, right? So emotions can really kind of block our wise thinking. And that's
So
why I
what you're
think the
saying, if we
non-cognitive
apply it to,
components.
for
Hmm.
example, an organizational context or whatever, or political or social leadership, it means that you can be very developed in cognitive, this cognitive component, but unless you have a certain level, would you say that, of
Yeah.
development also, and resources, I mean, in this emotion and openness and uh, and caring, then you will not be able to function optimally, right? This is
You
what you're
may be
saying?
able to function optimally in terms of very theoretically problems, right? And that's the thing that we
Ah,
usually use in the lab when we want to measure wisdom. We present people with a theoretically problem of a fictitious
right.
person. And I've seen people sometimes in the lab talking really kind of wise soundingly about these problems, right? So one of the
Right.
Berlin problems, like the problems developed by the Berlin group to measure wisdom, is a 15-year-old girl wants to move out from home immediately. What could one consider and do in such a situation? And I've seen lots of people talking quite wisely about, well, 15-year-old girls and puberty and whatever and different
Right.
reasons and so on. And at the same time, with some people, you just know, if it were their own 15-year-old daughter, and I have a 15-year-old daughter, so I know what I'm talking about, um, this would be a totally different story, right? Because it
Right.
is really difficult. I guess all of us who have children know this. It's really difficult to take this wise stance sometimes when your child is, acting up in some kind of strange or complicated or difficult way. And so I guess, yeah, the difference is very much in, can you use this theoretical knowledge that you may have in a real time challenging real life situation, right? And that's where the non cognitive components come in and why they are pretty crucial for wise behavior in real life.
Yeah. Okay. So, oh, that's amazing. Okay. So, nice relationship between these two. Some questions are coming to my mind. One is that mindfulness is like has gone very much like in a big way
Yeah,
in Europe. I mean, in US, of course, and in Europe also, and in India, I would
absolutely.
say is beginning. So, and as we know, it is based on some, let's say, Indian wisdom tradition and Buddhist and so on, and many practices. So, how would you bring some elements of this mindfulness? Because when you say, yeah, I am able to have some space and not to be overwhelmed by what the situation might trigger for me and color my appreciation of things and so on, it looks very much like
Absolutely.
some elements of mindfulness that we have been hearing about. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm absolutely not an expert on mindfulness, but I
Yeah.
totally agree. Things like being able to see things as they are and not
Right.
colored by all those different schemata you have in your own head about, and all those different, I don't know, ways you don't want to see things, but just
Right.
really seeing a situation as it is, or basically looking at your own feelings, right? Being able to kind of look at, okay, what am I feeling right now? Like this kind of anxiety thing is clenching my stomach, and I just look
Yeah.
at it and basically say, okay, how does this feel? And that already enables you in a way to take this step back, and also being able to, yeah, just focus on the thing at hand and kind of controlling your emotions in this way. I think this is a very powerful way to achieve some of those
Excellent.
non-cognitive components. Yeah.
Okay. So now I would like to come to this idea of uh, this professional wisdom. So you're using, I mean, in our conversation as we're preparing this, we are using this word. Can you explain what is this professional wisdom, and is it the same or is it different, and how it would be different from wisdom? I mean, that we have been speaking about.
I mean, I generally think it all fits to our into our elephant model. But when you look at how wisdom has been mostly conceptualized and studied, then I think there are some differences. And professional wisdom has not been captured by some of those wisdom models. So some of them are just about theoretical wisdom, so-called general wisdom, like the Berlin model,
Hmm.
which just basically talks about a certain way of reasoning about problems wisely. And on the other hand, there are approaches like Monica Ardell's three-dimensional model, which basically
Right.
says wisdom is this personality thing, which brings it very much to people's own lives and own experiences. But when you're like being trying to be wise in your job, it often a major factor is really bringing your own personality in some kind of line with your organization's values
Right.
and needs, and also some other people's needs. We've looked a lot into wise teachers, which I think is a really
Ah.
interesting field, because we all would want to have wise teachers, and not too many teachers are really as wise as we would like them to be.
So what
And
would be a wise teacher? Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a big question, right? So what
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
be
I
a
like
wise
that.
teacher? And we actually did studies where we asked students, like psychology students, if they had a wise teacher, and if so, to tell us about some experiences they'd had with that wise teacher. It was really interesting to look at that. And so one component clearly was caring about students, right? So being able to really connect to students, to being this authentic person. But at the same time, we also talked to teachers, among others, who had been nominated as wise. And they actually talked about caring about students, but they also talked about kind of keeping a certain distance, not getting completely immersed in
Right.
those kind of relationships, right? Because of course your job is to teach these kids, let's say, mathematics or whatever, and not to just have relationships with them. And of course there's a dynamic between both, and you need a certain kind of relationship to be able to even kind of fascinate them. But too much, getting too close, is also a bit of a problem, and will also really be hard for teachers sometimes, right? So there's
Okay.
always a component of regulating relationships, regulating your own emotions, while at the same time really caring. Then you may have like connections with parents who have completely different values than you have as a person, right? And so how do you negotiate that? Or how do you
Right.
negotiate when the school system basically in some aspects stands against what you think would be really right in certain situations? There was actually one thing that kind of came out of the study as well. The truly wise teachers tended to sometimes bend or even break the rules just a little bit when it was really for the sake of a student or something. So
A
I like
certain
that part of it.
flexibility and not
Yeah,
just going by
yeah.
the book, maybe. Yeah,
Exactly,
absolutely.
knowing what's really important, and sometimes just
Right.
something else is really more important than keeping with all the rules, right? So
Uh-huh.
basically, um, so that's just an example of professional wisdom, being able to kind of be yourself, but also accepting that other people have different needs and that the organization has different needs, and kind of balancing all those different requirements in a way that still enables you to act wisely. So I think there's
Hmm.
some aspects that are more important for professional wisdom than maybe when it's just about your own life, and you have to make decisions that may be really important and really difficult, but you basically
Right.
think about yourself and maybe some close relationships. Professional wisdom is more about, yeah, balancing all those different kinds of needs and goals and
Okay.
values.
So
Right.
let's try another scenario. For example, I am a surgeon, right? A
Okay.
neurosurgeon. I am a neurosurgeon, and the patient I have has some, let's say, tumor in the brain, and I have two options. One is, for example, to which is risky and which would lead with, let's say, 60-70% chances to this surgery not working and the patient dying. But there will be no side effect and it will be a total success and he will be back to normal. But the other scenario, which is less risky, is to do a surgery but with another route. But then the risk is that, and most likely, he will be impaired in some of the function of the brain. So let's say, for example, some usage of his upper part of the body, his hands or whatever. Right? So how does wisdom, if we take this scenario, which is a difficult, let's say, it's a complex like kind of situation, and with a lot of uncertainty because there are all this probability, but you cannot really pinpoint exactly what can happen
Absolutely.
during the
Yeah.
procedure. So can we read that through this model, Judith? I'm just
Right.
yeah,
So, I mean, I would hope that a surgeon will generally be relatively calm. So I think that part of the model should hopefully be there. And I would
yeah,
also hope that a surgeon or doctors in general care a lot about their patients, right? So obviously, the kind of main focus of this whole thing has to be what
yeah,
the good for the patient, right? And there might probably theoretically be situations where this is not that as much in the focus of the surgeon's mind as it should be, because the surgeon might really want to try out this new procedure and become very famous and
exactly.
something like that.
Yes,
And that
yeah,
a wise surgeon wouldn't be like that, right? So a surgeon would really want to kind of put first what the patient's needs are, and would
and
have
not
this
maybe also
calmness and be able to
the cost of the surgery,
yeah,
which
exactly.
will
The
give
next thing
more
is
to
the
the
cost, right? And how
yeah.
many hours does it take? So that would not be in the focus.
Okay,
But then, of course, it's also probably not easy to figure out what the patient's needs are, right? So you would have to
yeah,
have this really kind of honest, open conversation with the patient, and maybe the patient's, or probably the patient's family as well, where you basically lay out the different options and kind of explain the probabilities, and then look at and the patient would have to decide how important certain things are to them. So you would want to give them a little time for
right,
that. So you would try to kind of set up the situation in a way that gives the patient as much control as possible about the decision, right? And that's already something where, again, the aspect of systems comes in. So you would
right,
want to have a medical system that kind of allows for that, right? And okay, then let's say the patient kind of makes a decision that you don't think is is the wisest possible decision. Then you would try to talk with them about it, or maybe with the family. But at some point, I guess the idea would really be to let the patient decide. And then, of course, the other thing you would want to do as a wise surgeon is probably get the best possible care for this patient, right? And that might probably actually mean not doing the surgery yourself. If you feel like there's this other guy who has done this 20 times and I've only done it twice, or I
right,
haven't done it before, then the wise thing would probably be to say, okay, let's bring this other person in, because the probability is higher then, right? Or even if you decide to do it yourself and you're a wise surgeon, you would prepare very, very carefully, right? You would really want to do this as well as possible. So that would be the more cognitive aspect, I guess, really trying to figure out the different options and through which parts of the brain you can go, and so on, and to really prepare as best you can, right? So I guess that would be both options, and probably with a lot of self-reflection, really constantly trying to see, am I really doing the best for the patient,
right.
or is it my little ego that wants to do this surgery, and things like that, right? So I think
Right,
I
right.
could imagine a wise surgeon. I've seen some really quite wise doctors in my own life, and yeah,
Absolutely.
others
Yeah,
not so
absolutely.
much. Yeah, so I
Not
think
just like extremely skilled, I mean, having this
no,
surgical
that's a
or
different.
whatever skill,
Yeah,
diagnostic skills, but it's totally different. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
absolutely. I had one doctor, and I chatted with him. I liked him so much. He was this kind of authentic, warm person, and I chatted with him about situations where he had really had a hard time. He was this a gynecologist, right? So he was the person who brought my two children to life, and so to the world. And basically, he and I talked after my daughter was born. We chatted just a little bit about like the different difficult situations in his profession, like when women have
Right.
cancer and things like that, and how he
Right.
deals with those really challenging situations. And then he said this thing that totally struck me as incredibly, I don't know, caring at least. He said, when it gets really difficult, when I have to make a decision and and this is really kind of about life and death or something, I always try to imagine that the woman in question is my wife or my daughter. And I do what I would like to do if that were the case. And I thought
Excellent.
this was
Yeah.
so amazing, right? In terms of just
Yeah.
basically really wanting to ensure that you're doing your best to just basically imagine this person being close to you and not just being some kind of random patient, right? So that's what was
Yeah.
one of those sentences that I will always remember, I guess.
Very human. Yeah. Yeah. In that
Yeah.
way, it's very human. Yeah. Yeah. Then Judith, I was thinking about, let's say, this development of this wisdom. So, what was interesting in what you have written, and you're distinguishing between short-term intervention and long-term intervention. Okay, so short-term intervention. Let's assume that we're speaking about short-term intervention, and I am a CEO in a company, and I want to develop my own wisdom and the wisdom of, let's say, my top 10 or 50 people first, right? So how will I go about that? I mean, if we go with your model. Yeah.
Let's say you have some kind of concrete problem and you want to try to think
Yes.
wisely about it. So there are
Yes.
some really nice strategies, I think, that have been shown by studies to basically work. So one of them is just simply what Igor Grossman has been doing in his studies, things like just imagine this not happening to you, but happening to a good friend. What would you tell the
Okay.
friend? And then it turns out you
Okay.
sometimes immediately are one step wiser if you don't see
Yeah.
yourself in the problem. Another thing that Igor has shown to be quite effective is to simply think about the problem in third person language as opposed to first person language, right? To just basically say he or she is in this problem instead of saying I'm in this problem, right? And that already seems to really enable us to think in this kind of more distanced way.
Yes.
Another thing, and that's a study that I like a lot, and it's also it's not magic or anything. It's just basically a study that Ursula Staudinger and Paul Baltes did quite a while ago. And they basically showed that imagining to talk to someone else about the problem before actually responding to one of those written problems made people
Right.
quite a bit wiser. So just basically, I would think in a kind of complicated CEO situation, maybe to have a few people in your head. And we actually once did a little study where we tried this out. It was just a student's master thesis, but it was nice. She had people imagine, she looked for people who had some kind of problem, and then she had them do this little exercise where they imagined, I don't remember the exact people, but they tried to imagine like their own grandmother. Or was it themselves as a grandmother? I'm not sure. I'm sure that they thought about themselves as a child. What would they have
Yes.
said when they were a child? And then I think two more people, someone that they turned to for advice and some other people. And they imagined discussing the problem with all those different people, just to get those different perspectives of people they knew reasonably well. And it turned out it helped them actually solve the
Okay.
problem. So it might be this doesn't have to be this particular selection of people, but if you're a CEO, there might be this really wise person, really wise CEO that you admire. And then there might be another
What
person
he
that you
did.
admire,
Yeah.
maybe not for
Yeah.
wisdom, but for their smartness or their knowledge about a certain field. So you could kind of try to channel these different people's ways of thinking about the problem and kind of constructing in your own head a discussion
Yeah.
about it, right? And I think that's really a powerful instrument in a way. I hope I'm going to get to do a little study with teachers where we
Yes.
try to talk to them about the perfect wise teacher and then kind of enable them to challenge this person or to channel this person the next time they are faced with a
Okay.
problem, to just imagine what would so and so do. But yeah, I'm not sure I'll get that project funding, but it
So
would be
that's
nice to.
interesting. Interesting way. I was thinking about something else, which was in line maybe with some of the experiment, which is why don't we put this leader in some situations, I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
organization or political or whatever, and see how they are, let's say, behaving in this situation, and maybe bring not like generic situation, but remind them of situation where they have been through, or
Mm-hmm.
somebody else which is close to them has been through, and try to bring all these elements or some process or something to come with a wise decision and therefore a wise, let's say, action. So is this something which can be working? I mean, this case study
I would think
basically
so. Yeah.
is working well. I mean, in management education, we have a lot of case studies.
Hmm.
And for example, when I am teaching leadership, let's say, qualities and developing, not only I take third person, but then I ask them to reflect upon some difficult and challenges that they had gone through, and now look at it from, as you said, a third person perspective, right? And look at what they could have done better and so on. So is it one way to go about it?
I would definitely think so. Yes. I mean, I
Yeah,
generally am a great believer in wisdom as basically learning from one's own life, right? And
right,
I think some people learn kind of automatically because they are kind of self-reflective and because they are
right.
open to new perspectives. So they do think about what happened and why did it happen and what did I do and what could I have done differently. And then
Hmm.
those are the people who grow wiser. And to other people, this kind of thinking may not come so naturally, right? And so I think then just basically making them think in this way and reflect on past challenges should probably be very, very effective, I would think. Yeah.
Okay. But if we come back to this certain level of non-cognitive component that needs to be there, so I have also to ensure, if I have a CU, that I take care of these elements also, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely, right? Because otherwise, all your knowledge will leave you in the moment you need it
so it
most, right?
means we can envisage some modules of like emotional regulation and showing like
Yeah.
let's say
Yeah.
letting this caring element for people flow out and be developed and so on, right?
Yeah, I think the caring element maybe a challenge sometimes is
Yeah,
depending on what an organization is about, right? When I have an organization that basically has the main goal of just making money and ripping people
right.
off as well as
Yeah.
possible, then yeah, getting this caring mindset might just make people quit their jobs. And actually, when we did the interviews with managers about what they had done wisely, some of them said
Mm.
they had just quit certain jobs because they felt they weren't in line with their own values, and that was the wisest thing they ever did, right? So sometimes
Right.
yeah, the goals of an institution or whatever kind of business you have might just not be very, very compatible with wisdom, right? But and especially with this caring idea of doing a common good, right? I mean, there are organizations that totally care about the common good, and they are basically made to kind of foster common goods, like NGOs sometimes and things like that.
Right.
Actually, we would want like governments to aim for a common good, obviously. But then at the same time, yeah, sometimes the people who reach high levels in these organizations aren't really aiming for a common good very much, because that's not what makes them successful, right? And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
kind of more than just basically having some kind of intervention that fosters being caring, because when being caring doesn't help you with your job, then you won't be caring, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. There was another thing I was totally fascinated by that, which was you are saying that for this real life situation and making people reflect on them and be totally immersed in that and try to look at themselves like how they are navigating through that and taking decisions. One nice technological innovation might help. It is all this, let's say, simulation and this virtual reality. So I'm totally fascinated by that. I
Yeah,
have to
me
say
too.
that.
I mean, we
Yeah,
haven't done any research on that yet, but I'm
yeah,
totally hoping to get this kind of research going, right? Where you can actually really, I mean, even watching a movie can be very emotionally immersive, right? But then
yeah.
basically playing a part in a story,
Being
right? And
inside. Yeah,
really being
yeah.
inside and talking to people and everything. I mean, that might really be kind of, I mean, there is research already, like anxiety trainings, people who are
Right,
afraid of flying, putting them in kind of virtual planes and letting them have the experience again and again until they're ready to do it in real life. And I'm
right.
totally thinking that, yeah, really looking at how people act in challenging virtual situations might really be an important future of wisdom research, where you can
Yeah.
totally create problems and then let people act in them, right? But yeah, this is still future, I guess. But yeah, I'm fascinated by that as well.
But I think not so. It will be close. I think
Yeah, I mean, I think so
I will
too.
look
Yeah.
into that. 5, 10 years maximum. I
Yeah,
think we'll
yeah,
go into
I would
that.
also
Yeah,
think, yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't depend. It doesn't have to be like, when you look into like fancy video games,
yeah.
they are
Exactly.
perfect technically, but it doesn't have to be like that. They don't have
Yeah.
to be visually really perfect and everything. It's just because people are really relatively easy, I think, to immerse in stories. I mean, I've seen video games. My kids play video games, and as you probably know, there's this whole genre of kind of video games that are really not about like shooting people or anything or driving cars,
Right.
but about that really have story-based video games, and some of them have really beautiful stories, and some of them are really about wisdom. And there are games where you have to make moral decisions in really complex situations and things like that. And I think that's really fascinating. And we are hoping to do some research on how some people may actually learn and grow from playing those kinds of games, right? Like just like from reading books, but more because you're much more
Exactly.
inside the story, right?
So good, Judith. Let me know when you're in that, and I will let you know when I'm trying to find some techies here in India who are
Yay,
interested in that kind of
that would
stuff.
be fantastic. Yes.
So, Judith, comes the end of our conversation. Anything you would like to add that maybe I would not have asked you, or some summary or some conclusion or some hope you have for this wisdom research to percolate into society or whatever?
Yeah, that's maybe a good end point, right? I mean, I'm really scared when I look at the future of our planet, right? Like as most people are, and I have, as I said, I have two children. I mean, they are basically 15 and 20, so one of them is not a child anymore, but none of them is a child anymore, and I'm really kind of worried about their future, right? So I feel that we really need to do something about the future of this planet, and I'm thinking how can wisdom, what we can probably do best is kind of apply our knowledge about wisdom to make the world a better place, right? And so I'm really struggling with this question, and I would really hope for a lot of people to start thinking about this question: how can we make the world wiser, not just on the individual level? I think it's really important to make every single person a little wiser, maybe, but also on the system level that I mentioned, right? So if we still elect the wrong politicians because we don't go for wisdom but for like simple answers to complex questions, then we won't make a change in the world, right? So I think this is really the big challenge now, not just to wisdom research, but also to wisdom research. How can we really apply what we've learned to actually help our world?
Beautiful, Judith. Okay, so we'll end by these wise words, Judith, and thanks a lot for this conversation.
Thank you. This has been great fun, and very interesting. Thank you so much.
You were listening to Sapience, a special podcast series by SPJIMR Institute of Management and Research, Mumbai, brought to you by SPJIMR Center for Wisdom in Leadership, produced by Vinita Dwivedi and the communications team.